Welcome. This is Ken Barron. I'm with the National Association of Black and White Men Together. Before we start this, would you mind subscribing to any of our platforms or liking us and comment us in the appropriate place? We'd appreciate that. So today, voting and the filibuster. I'm sure you're all aware that Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema made it clear that we were not in favor of altering the filibuster to pass voting rights legislation. Activists have been fighting this battle for nearly a year without much support from the White House. Biden gave a big voters' rights speech recently in Philadelphia, calling the Republican assault on voting rights the, quote, 21st century Jim Crow, end quote. But in that speech, he never once mentioned the filibuster. Voting rights activist groups like the League of Women Voters, People for the American Way, and Declaration for American Democracy engaged in direct actions, quote, demanding that the President Biden use his full force of his office to support federal voting rights legislation, end quote. And that's what the League said. Our friend, the Reverend William Barber, the second of the Poor People's Campaign, said, quote, Mr. President, we want you to succeed and we want to stand by you, but we need you to fight against the filibuster because the filibuster is being used to fight against us and to bring down democracy. Biden never met with them. The White House says that it is going to keep fighting, but the fighting has been raging for months now as the president focused most of his time and energy on a spending bill that now is stalled. We are in the last stages of the fight for voting rights, and democracy is losing. In particular, the full participation of black voters and other voters of colors as an issue is losing. Failure on voting rights now would be historic. Black people have less voting power now than they have during the civil rights era. Republicans are the true villains here, but we must mobilize and mobilize now as if our lives depended on it. The reason for this failure here to protect the voting rights is so crucial. And why is that? Because the slate of bills currently being advanced by state legislators is an opening salvo in a long Republican war to curtail voting. If the Republicans see that they can get away with the current suppression, they'll simply pass more bills. Georgia is already taking another bite at the apple, attempting to pass a second slate of voter repression restrictions. And that follows the ones they enacted after the 2020 election. As an example, U.S. Justice Department announced today that it filed a lawsuit against the state of Georgia, the Georgia Secretary of State, and the Georgia State Elections Board. The United States complaint challenges provisions of the Georgia Senate Bill 202 under Section 2 of that famous Voting Rights Act. This includes, and here's the list for us, 1. A provision banning government entities from distributing unsolicited absentee ballot applications. 2. The imposition of costly and onerous fines on civic organizations, churches, and advocacy groups that distribute follow-up absentee ballot applications. The shortening of the deadline to request absentee ballots to 11 days before the election day, and the requirement that voters do not have identifications issued by the Georgia Department of Driver Services for photocopy, another form of identification, in order to request an absentee ballot without allowing for the use of the last 4 digits of a Social Security number for such applications. That's the number 3 point on that. And number 4, limitations on counties' use of absentee ballot drop boxes. And of course, number 5, the prohibition on efforts by churches and civil groups to provide food or water. Just think of that, to persons waiting in long lines to vote. And lastly, number 6, the prohibition on counting out of provisional ballots cast before 5 p.m. on election days. These are typical of Republicans' sneaky methods today and likely to continue unless we stop them. The NABWMT is committed to preventing the suppression of voting rights. Thank you for listening. We appreciate all of your support and look